Okay, this is the audio review for From Transgender to Trans, the ongoing struggle for the inclusion, acceptance, and celebration of identities beyond the binary, by Joelle Ruby Ryan from Race, Class, and Gender, 10th edition. The reading starts by discussing Caitlyn Jenner's ABC interview about her transition that was watched by 17 million people. And so the response to Jenner in the transgender community was mixed. There was excitement from some for having a famous public figure, right, that brings attention to transgender issues, while critics in trans communities were cautious due to Caitlyn Jenner's overall location, social location, and political orientation, meaning issues of fame, privilege, whiteness, appearance, femininity, medical versus non-medical transitioning, and of course mass media were all signs of caution in relation to Jenner. So what became clear to Joelle Ryan was the ways in which contemporary statements of transgender identity have generally failed to expand upon options beyond the binary of man and woman in the mainstream culture. So the umbrella formulations have often served to relegate non-binary identities to the margins due to political expediency, internalized oppression in the trans community, and the desire for media validation and approval from mainstream culture. So the motivation is strong to conform to mainstream narratives or to seek acceptance, validation, and encouragement in the culture. In the 1990s, there was not the same kind of community as today. Back then, there was a sort of bifurcated community that divided people into either transvestites, who were considered heterosexual males who cross-dressed, or transsexuals, who were expected to transition to the opposite, quote-unquote opposite, gender through hormones and surgery. The belief in the culture was that a transsexual person was a person trapped in the wrong body. So these social notions affected the identity of the author, Joelle Ryan. And it wasn't until college that Ryan found books by theorists, scholars, and activists that introduced the idea of living beyond the binary. So claiming an alternative identity to the binary was very appealing to Ryan. The ability to identify not as a man or woman, but on a continuing spectrum of infinite possibilities beyond our limited cultural concepts of gender and sexuality was appealing. So I'm going to read you a quote from the chapter, or from the reading, from page 147. Understanding non-binary gender identities enabled me to realize that I could express my gender however I wished, and I could customize my own transition in ways that resonated with my own complexity, rather than conform to a cookie-cutter formulation of transsexualism created by non-transgender, quote-unquote, experts. So that's the author talking about their personal experience with these social identities and coming to terms with the kind of notions in the mainstream culture, but then learning about identities beyond the binary and those kind of possibilities. So the problem is that there's such tremendous resistance to gender beyond the binary. Those who are both or neither are often beyond the scope of many people's understanding. There's also the problem of stigma in gay, lesbian, and bisexual communities, as well as heterosexual communities, which often glorifies masculinity, which can stigmatize trans women and other trans feminine people. Intersectional feminism was very important for the author. So Ryan explains about feminism and women's studies being helpful in establishing connections between gender oppression and other forms of oppression, such as racism, classism, or ableism. So Ryan cites Audre Lorde, Gloria Anzaldúa, Bell Hooks, and Patricia Hill Collins, who provided critical tools to analyze power differentials in society and envisioned ways of mounting efforts for equality and social justice that were inclusive of multiple identities and cognizant of multiple axes of oppression. These authors all illuminate the problem of white middle-class bias in feminism. So Joelle Ryan argues that there's similar problems with cisgendered privilege and bias, which make clear through analysis of the ideological and political blind spots that result. So there's also the medical model of transsexualism. This idea of erasing transness to pass as a woman or a man in a binary, right? To go from one closet to another. So instead of shame and self-hatred that results from this medical model, you can be open and visible as transgender to promote self-acceptance and pride. And this was the goal of the author. So moving on to Tears in the Umbrella, limits to trans diversity and inclusion. Transgender is an umbrella term that includes diverse gender expressions. However, many people just substitute the word transgender for transsexual. Within more media, the realities of people who live beyond gender binaries have been minimized in efforts for trans acceptance and assimilation into mainstream society. So in New Hampshire, basically around the time of the article, there was no law prohibiting discrimination in employment, housing, credit, and public accommodations on the basis of gender identity or gender expression. So in 2009, a bill was introduced to the state legislature in New Hampshire to provide these protections, but it was opposed by conservatives and Christian groups that called it a bathroom bill and argued against it and against facts, basically saying that the legislation would enable transgender women to go to the bathroom in women's bathrooms. And so they organized opposition to this bill. So an education program came from the push to build a trans community in response to this, right, in the state to promote visibility and educate for local and state acceptance of trans people. At this time, the author was told that as a non-binary person, their perspective would be too confusing for people at the session that do not understand basic trans issues. This was heartbreaking for Ryan and illustrates how the non-binary are often pushed to the margins instead of being included, which is particularly upsetting when you realize that the education session is to try to create acceptance. You're saying only certain gender presentations or identities are palatable, which just reinforces those inequalities instead of breaking them down, not to mention the emotional toll of being sidelined. So assimilationist politics are not new within gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender communities. Assimilationism refers to the political strategy of targeted social groups trying to conform as much as possible to the culture of the dominant group. The idea is that if the oppressed act more like the oppressor, or better reflect the oppressors, they'll be better treated and more easily accepted in mainstream society. So this is a deeply flawed tactic that will always leave people behind and implicitly and explicitly reinforce that the dominant group is superior, preferable, and universal. So there's a couple examples that the author gives, such as when Sylvia Rivera in 1973 was booed off the stage at New York City Pride due to assimilationist and anti-trans politics of the gay and lesbian organizers. And a more recent example, when a transgender woman of color called attention to the plight of transgender women in U.S. detention centers, forcing them into men's jails and horrific treatment in ICE custody during an Obama event at the White House. Geneset Gutierrez was booed and ejected from the White House and was dressed down by Obama to applause from the many white cisgender gays and lesbians at the event. The mainstream media described Gutierrez as a heckler rather than a transgender activist who was calling out Obama on issues that are important and largely ignored. The media should have used this as an opportunity to discuss issues of xenophobia, racism, and trans-misogynistic state-sponsored violence, but largely, especially mainstream media, reinforces hegemony, so Gutierrez was sidelined as well. So dominant culture, mainstream media, and the politics of assimilation. There needs to be a unified community where everyone's included. So this so-called acceptance of Caitlyn Jenner was actually quite limited and highly conditional. So first, it's problematic to focus on someone that doesn't represent the majority of trans people, right? Jenner is white, wealthy, a former Olympic athlete, is famous, camera ready, thin, able-bodied, and a Republican. So many cisgender people acted as if Caitlyn Jenner invented transgender identity. Popular media has also privileged hypermasculine men becoming hyperfeminine women, and vice versa. This is very problematic, how much attention has been paid to her appearance and passability. So the problem is not that people fit into binary gender roles. The problem is the assumption that everyone can and should fit into such roles. And the idea that everyone needs to pass as cisgender to be fully accepted, it's not transformative. It's oppressive, right? It illustrates a very conditional acceptance. So we need to affirm and accept people's gender identities, including their names. This happens so often in the media where people are misgendered or where the media will use, a name that is not a person's chosen name. For instance, Chelsea Manning, the whistleblower who was in prison in horrible conditions for years, she had to fight for many years to get a legal name change and to receive hormone treatments or wear women's garments in prison. She was often disparaged in the media and intentionally misgendered. And those journalists, and often Fox personalities, would not use her chosen name because they were trying to reinforce binary expectations of gender. So when Caitlyn Jenner's transition got so much attention that focused on her hyperfemininity, it further sidelines others in trans communities, such as those who are not able to transition or don't want to medically transition. So the author points out that so many trans folks are also extremely economically marginalized, right? And face a lot of discrimination in work, in hiring, often facing high levels of unemployment, just struggling to survive. So many trans people face discrimination and have to fight for basic dignity and respect. So the focus on someone like Jenner, without the context of the larger community, shifts focus away from the most marginal in the media coverage. And it's the same with trans men. The most privileged or the most acceptable to our patriarchal system are the ones that receive focus, while non-binary folks are erased from the conversation. So the images in the culture of high-profile trans people affects the lives of everyday trans people. The coverage that ignores their existence can be very emotional to face when you say, well, this is what trans is, but it's extremely limiting and only includes, again, notions of gender representation that are closer to what's acceptable in the patriarchal system, right? So Ryan further argues that other factors in an intersectional analysis, such as weightism, lookism, transphobia, that these things combine as a lethal force that can then further vulnerability in depression, suicide, exploitation, and violence. So it's not about demonizing Jenner, right? The problem is the social system that says that some bodies have value and other bodies have no value, or erase or otherwise marginalize certain bodies. So trans, this new identity label, is designed specifically to create and call attention to non-binary identities under the trans umbrella, creating a way to avoid previous binary understandings in an attempt to call attention to the wide spectrum of diverse gender variant people. The goal is expanded inclusion that doesn't push people to the margins or erase their identities or experiences. So ways that push back against trans and homonormative tendencies and call for renewed insurgence of queer and trans militancy and radicalism is really what the author's calling for, right? Of transforming trans politics by really pushing back against these kind of tendencies towards assimilationism. So again, in the GLBT spectrum, there's been a strong emphasis on assimilating into mainstream heteronormative institutions and into dominant cultural life. So yes, there needs to be marriage equality. There needs to be adoption and other legal protections and institutional access. But this focus often benefits those with the most power at the expense of the more marginalized. So instead, Ryan argues, we need a bottom-up model that empowers and protects non-binary folks. So it's essential as visible queerness and gender nonconformity make for risk of violence and other social harm. Intersectional queer transfeminism can advocate for political strategies to better reflect the full community and offer analyses of power differentials. So it's important to lift up the gender outlaws, and we really need to push back on media, demand coverage of non-binary identities, and push for genderqueer and non-binary inclusion and visibility. But beyond media, everybody needs to challenge the gender binary system in their everyday lived experiences, in their lives. So one part of this is an important aspect of changing issues into the future is teaching kids beyond the binary, reducing these kind of stigmas and hierarchies in future generations. We know these things are socially constructed, so we can construct something more inclusive, right? And as well, we can grapple with these cultural limiting narratives and destroy or expand them to represent all of the beautiful diversity and ensure that people are not targeted and don't face violence or death just because of who they are.